Can you hear the balalaikas ringing out? Grab yourself a comrade, keep yourself warm, because we are talking about communism. So you might be wondering, why have I chosen to talk about communism? Didn't we slam the door on that malarkey back in the late 80s and 90s when the Soviet Union fell without a shot fired and the Berlin Wall came down? Well, what I'm going to be contending in this vlog is that communism didn't go into spontaneous remission back there. It is actually metastasized. It's very much with us right now. And it actually forms the backdrop for so much else that I want to be talking about when it comes to the charts of maybe Germany, South Africa, the issue of Agenda 21. That I feel it's necessary to revisit this thing of communism and find out where it is and how it's influencing us. Now, what communism, whereas our governments in Western democracy, so-called, they're obsessed with short-termism, but communists think decades, centuries ahead. So while our governments stumble from crisis to crisis like a drunk stumbling from bar to bar looking for his next fix, these guys are subtly working away in the background. And so, you know, we can't discount it. So where does astrology come into this? Remember I said to you, what do the charts of countries tell us that's not immediately obvious? So for example, when I did the chart of Holland, I had a look and I said, well, there's sun in the 4th house, so this says to us the agriculture is really important. Yeah, but we already knew that. But when I looked at the chart of South Africa and of Russia, and more recently of Saudi Arabia, I saw something I wasn't expecting to see, and that got me digging for more information. So it's really on the basis of the South African and the Russian chart that I saw these countries are not in control of their own destiny. They're almost like, you know, guinea pig countries, experiment countries. And so that got me thinking. Then I also got to thinking back in the late 80s, early 90s, we had Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, all in Capricorn, which is, you know, the sign of capitalism. And so we had the start of 3 major new cycles: the Uranus-Neptune cycle, the Saturn-Neptune cycle, and the Saturn-Uranus cycle. 2 of those are specifically to do with communism. So why, when communism is so-called falling, do we have all these indications in the chart of major new socio-political cycles involving communism just beginning? And that's when I think, you know, communism had gone now into a new phase. The other reason I think it's important to discuss this subject is you often hear people say, why is the left, even the hard left, got this like unholy alliance with institutions like the EU and big banks, big tech firms, you know, big money? Why are they all sticking together? It seems like they shouldn't be. Well, this blog will totally explain it. What I've called this is the Vulcanus Agenda. Now, I've kind of coined that phrase, so you won't find it anywhere else. But this particular symbol is for the asteroid Vulcanus, which is a trans-Neptunian. And it's not really much important about the planet. It's a symbol I'm interested in, because this is what we have: the power grab, the power, the elites, the leaders of the left. They're all getting further and further away. Here we are, flatlining, middle class being wiped out, and the ones at the top are getting more and more wealthy and more and more and more powerful. And that is key to what we're going to be talking about today. Right, so I thought that maybe we'd start with a little story that Reagan told. So going back to the Soviet era, there was this guy in Moscow, and he wanted to buy a car, which was no easy thing, you know, when you lived in the Soviet Union. He had to queue for hours at the Department of Transport, then the Department of Licensing, then the Department of Finance, and after many months of queuing and filling in masses of forms, he is finally ready to get his car. So he gets to the front of the queue, he hands all over his forms, and the guy's stamping them and checking everything, and he says, "Fine, comrade, you are ready to have your car." And he says to the guy, "Look, it'll be delivered exactly 10 years today." So the guy said, "Will that be the morning or the afternoon?" And the guy says, "Well, what difference does it make? It's in 10 years' time." He says, "Yes, but the plumber's coming that morning." So there you go. That's the efficiency of communism for you. So the first thing we're going to do in this vlog is look at the 54 goals of communism. Now, I'm not going to go through all 54, don't worry, just a few key ones. So back in Congress in 1963, Congressman A.S. Hurlong presented these goals of communism to Congress as a kind of warning. And if you go through all 54, which you know, I'll put a link so you can yourself, you'll see that every single one has been achieved. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the key ones. So the first goal was to achieve free trade. So, I mean, especially if you're over in the UK with Brexit, all you ever hear about is free trade. But is free trade really free? Or is it just a way of globalizing. Free trade's not free because your country loses jobs. You may have to make sacrifices in terms of your political control, in terms of borders. Isn't free trade just a way of globalizing? In many cases, free trade is a way of giving all the power that your government has to make trade deals to an unelected, unaccounted third-party body who may not act in the interests of your citizens. So this whole thing of free trade, it's not all it's cracked up to be, and it's a key tool of globalism. The next thing that they wanted was to make sure that instead of just having the USSR as one voter in the UN, it was to make all the little satellite states that we've got, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, I mean they go on and on, don't they? Get them all added to the UN as separate countries and therefore increasing the voting power. So that's definitely been achieved. So they also wanted to keep Russia having access to the patent office, the US patent office, but we'll come to that. Now, you'll all know that schools in the West, in the UK and the US, are totally controlled by the left. A few years ago, Theresa May wanted to start an initiative where schools had to teach British values. So the very militant NUT, National Union of Teachers, who are kind of the most biggest lefties out there, they just flat out said no. They went against her and they said no. I'm sorry, that's colonialist, it's imperialist, we're just not doing it, and they refuse to do it. So there's an attack on what we would see as British or American values. We hear that often on the radio. I've noticed you'll get the presenter will have a call-in saying, what are British values? And the whole purpose of the show is to diss the whole concept. So if anyone rings in and said, well, I think this is a British value, they'll basically say to you, oh no, that's just a common sense value, or all countries have that. So the idea is to undermine the feeling that your country has any values, because once that's gone, you know, do you really have a country? The other key thing is controlling the unions. Oh, well, we know that happens. And you know, Jeremy Corbyn's got this new initiative where he wants the workers to have a 10% voting stock. Well, that's just a way of increasing, because unions have lost their power. That's just a way, again, of giving your workers more power. I don't think that would necessarily be a good thing, because the whole thing of being a worker is that you're not taking on any of the risk, but then you'd be getting additional rewards without taking on extra risk. And that's not capitalism, is it? Next thing, the goal of communism was to get control of universities. Oh, well, we can definitely tick that box, because we know that forever and a day, the universities, the lecturers and all that, they have been extremely left-wing. And that, my friends, is why they are university lecturers, because it's all theory. They never have to get out in the world and see if any of their wonderful theories actually work. They can just sit in their offices pontificating every day as they gather letters after their name, which are pretty meaningless. But it's not just about the university lecturers who are lefties. It's about the fact that the student unions, the sort of students that become involved in the student newspapers or the student unions, are usually very militant communists or leftists, and they can deplatform people and make sure that people with different views aren't allowed on campuses in order to get another message out there. So that's kind of important. Another thing that was on this list was ugly architecture. Can you believe it? But the psychology of architecture is actually quite interesting. So the idea was to demoralize people by having a lot of ugly, horrible buildings, like modern art. Most of it's pretty grim, isn't it? And it's because it has effect on you. Beauty is very good for your soul. And of course, communists don't believe we have a soul, do they? So you'll notice they ain't building any more Sacre-Cœurs, Taj Mahals, Via Venezias, or St. Paul's cathedrals, are they? No, they're not. Every city is starting to look very samey, because we all have these really tall skyscrapers, which pretty much look the same whichever city you go to. So that's another thing of it. That works for globalization as well, because it's taking the identity and the character of a city and they're making them all the same. Because what is great about things like London and makes it unique is the architecture. It goes towards the national pride, and of course they want to get rid of the nation, because communism is globalism. And the other thing that goes along with this, oh yeah, control of the press. Well, we know the lefties control the press. Although, you know, you get some people that will say, hold on, the BBC are very right-wing. Yeah, but the BBC are pro-business. That's not really right-wing. That fits all into this Vulcanus Agenda, doesn't it, where big business and the left are totally combined. In addition, we have one of the other goals of communism was to capture both political parties of the US. That's pretty much effectively been done, because between the Democrats and the rhinos, is there really a difference? Before Donald Trump came along, was there a difference at all? And the same in the UK here. There's no real difference between the Tories and the Blairites. You know, seen one, seen them all. Yes, Corbyn is dragging everyone off towards the left, and the Tories have become a lot more dragged off in that direction. So I'd say that's another box that they're ticking in terms of achieving things. Right, and yeah, the other important thing was to get control of the art critics and book reviewers in the newspaper, because that's really important. If you're only reviewing books that have a certain theme or a certain agenda that matches in what you're trying to push on the public consciousness, then you're making sure that those books will sell better, be more well received widely, and that they'll get those ideas of yours out there. So you can see they've done really well on all of this. The other thing was promoting debauchery as normal, promoting what is rude and base, and bringing out the worst of people, both sexually and everything, when it comes to television. So one of the things about the Tavistock Institute is they said you can hypnotize people or brainwash people to do almost anything. But apparently you cannot hypnotize someone. You know, you've all seen these shows where they get guinea pigs up and people volunteer and they make them do all crackpot things. But you can't hypnotize someone to do something against their morality. So you couldn't hypnotize someone to go and murder someone because it would be against the morality. So the whole thing with this agenda is an attack on people's morality, telling them there's no such thing as morals. You know, might is right. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, as Aleister Crowley said. And once you've got rid of that moral barrier, you can start getting people to do things for you. And I think where we can see that is how a lot of people, for example, Antifa, they feel that it's almost okay to attack someone who they've put a label on. So if they've labeled someone as a bigot, as a Nazi, or whatever, they feel it's okay to be vigilantes in that situation. So you can see that that's kind of working. Now, a lot of us in the West, we don't go to church very much anymore, and we don't think about our Christian roots. A lot of people would say they're not even that important, they're just common sense roots. But the communists identified Christianity as a key backbone to the American ethos, the American dream, the American culture, and they were determined to knock that out, because we might not think it's important, but they thought it was important, and they knew that to get control, you just get rid of that, and that would work. Okay, the other big things would infiltrate big business, which, as we've talked about, that's absolutely what's happened, especially with big tech firms. To discredit the family, that's why they encourage women to get to work, have your kids raised by the nursery down the road, get them to school as early as possible so the state have got control over them. Those nice lefties running the school, you know, we want them to have control of your kids. And the other big thing they wanted is to make sure that every colonial government, so for example in Africa, when it fell, it would be replaced by a Marxist government. They did that with ANC in South Africa, Samora Machel in Mozambique, in Angola the Cubans were there waging a civil war so they could take over, Zimbabwe, Zambia, all those countries fell to Marxist regimes. So that they were they were very successful in that, which didn't bode well for any of those countries who didn't get the governments that they probably deserved. So let's put that aside for a moment and think back to 1917 and the Russian Revolution. Now hold on there, I know a lot of you probably don't like history and you're going to switch off, you think, oh, it's boring, but this is really interesting and I'm going to be relating it a lot back to what's happening now, because it just shows you history never changes. This stuff that they're doing isn't new. They've been, you know, they've had this some book of tactics or book of a playbook that they've been using over and over, and this just proves it. So in March of 1917, there was the first part of the revolution when they got rid of the royals and they established a constitutional government. Now, this was pretty good. It could have worked out well. It was a constitutional government very much like what we have in other parts of the world. So at that stage, Trotsky, he was a penniless immigrant living in New York. Suddenly, he acquires $10,000. He gets on a boat bound for Russia. The Canadian authorities pull over the boat in Nova Scotia. Trotsky and his cohorts are arrested. There's immediate intervention from Washington and from London, after which Trotsky is released and he carries on his merry way. So who was he on this boat with, or this ship? Maybe we should have a look and see. Yeah. So anyway, on this boat with him was Lincoln Stevens, who was a key leftist in America. There was also Charles Crane of Westinghouse. If you've done a lot of study into Nikola Tesla, you will know all about Westinghouse. Charles Crane was not only part of Westinghouse, he was also head of the Democratic Finance Committee and a friend of Woodrow Wilson. So he wasn't just on this boat with any old nobody. At the same time, Vladimir Lenin is in Switzerland. He is put on a train by the German High Command and he heads off to Moscow to take part in the revolution. Now, one theory is that the Germans thought, oh, it'd be great, we start a revolution over in Russia, we take them out of the war, therefore we relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. But that's not the tack I'm going to be taking on this particular vlog. So the Russian Revolution kicks in, the October surprise, the Bolsheviks sort of take over in 1917. But what they don't tell you is it wasn't just the whites, which were like the nationalists, the pro-royalists, and the reds, which were the Bolsheviks. There were also the Greens, and there were 700,000 Greens, and they were doing rather well. The Greens were the real socialists, and they actually felt betrayed by the Bolsheviks, who they saw as an outside force coming in. So initially, the Bolsheviks weren't doing that well. They only held Moscow and Petrograd, which was St. Petersburg. But they were bolstered by a lot of money, and some of that money came from someone called Colonel William Boyce Thompson, who funded them to the tune of $1 million, which, I mean, back in then, that was a lot of money. So the next thing that's quite interesting is this Colonel William Boyce Thompson. He decides that there should be a Red Cross mission going to Russia. Now, the Russians didn't want a Red Cross mission, and the Red Cross in America didn't want to send a Red Cross mission, but he arranged it anyway. And guess who was on that Red Cross mission? There were 6 doctors, and all of the rest of them were bankers, mainly from Chase Bank and Citibank. Chase, which later became Chase Manhattan. And I thought, doesn't that sound very familiar to something that's going on today, i.e. the White Helmets, who are basically the money laundering and propaganda arm for ISIS in Syria. So again, even back then, they were using a kind of charitable institution to do regime change and to fund the kind of regime change operatives that they have put there. Recently in Parliament, an MP stood up and he said, do the White Helmets produce accounts, and have they kind of been audited? And the answer was that yes, they do produce accounts, but they're absolutely top secret. So if they were doing something that was so, you know, important and so great, why can't we see their accounts, you know? Odd, isn't it? So Russian Revolution takes place, the Bolsheviks take over, Sverdlov is sworn in as like the first president of the USSR. But at that stage, Russian industry is in, well, it wasn't in tatters, it was only in tatters in Moscow and St. Petersburg. In the rest of the country, it was just in a state of what they called technical preservation. So how did Russia get, or the Soviet Union as it was now, how did it get going again and get everything revved up? Well, it was not without help. Now, they'll always probably promote to you the success of how the Soviet Union got going, but it's not all it seems. So, in the 20s, there were US and German companies who went into the USSR, and they gave technical assistance via concessions and direct technical assistance to help restart the industry. Key to this was Westinghouse, Standard Oil, Ford, GM, General Electric, someone called Edwin Harriman, who was part of Brown Brothers Harriman, who you may know was George Bush Sr. worked for them, and they funded Hitler. So they were part of that, as well as Armand Hammer, and he was a big American industrialist. His father was actually head of the United States Communist Party. So he was key at the beginning there in kind of kick-starting the whole USSR. So by 1928, they've got back to their pre-war levels of production, and they're ready to start this 5-year plan. So as you know, the 5-year plans, you know, a big thing in communism. So if you don't mind, there are a couple of things that I have to read off here, because you know what history is about. History is about loads of geezers with names, and they're quite hard to remember if you haven't heard them too often. So during this first 5-year plan, guess who was behind it? An industrial architect called Kahn from Detroit. Also the companies Ford, DuPont, Universal Oil, Universal Engineering, McDonnell Douglas, GE, Douglas Air, Radio Corporation, Hercules. Many of the plants built, for example, the Caterpillar plant, were actually bigger than the similar plants in America. The Ford Motor Company had a massive big plant built in the USSR. Many years later, during the Vietnam War, when the guys from the States were flying their planes over and they could see all these trucks down on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they were saying, wow, those look like Ford trucks. Well, they were Ford trucks. They were built at the Gorky plant. And so American industry were helping to build up the USSR. Why? Again, we see this, that the key industrialists working with communists. And why were they doing it? So, and also the largest aluminium sheets in the world that they made for aircraft were made in the Soviet Union. The GE turbine plant was bigger than the one in New York State. They made more Caterpillars, I think I said, the JCB. And so that's how the USSR was kick-started. So we move on to 1933. it's time for their second year plan. And what's really interesting at the moment is this is the time when Hitler's coming to power and when Roosevelt is starting the New Deal. So once again, all these key industrialists are there, and they are now backing not only socialism in the USSR, they're backing another form of socialism with Hitler and another form of socialism in America in terms of the New Deal. So we have the key industrialists of America betraying the spirit of free enterprise and subsidizing and planning and promoting 3 different brands of socialism. So yeah, because Hitler and Roosevelt both came to power in 1933. There are bank transfer slips which actually show there were donations to Hitler via Hess of 60,000 Deutschmark from General Electric. And Gerald Spoke, who was the director of General Electric, as well as Owen Young of the Federal Reserve of New York, they were key to this, promoting these 3 different brands of socialism. So it was great because they were selling it, saying to Roosevelt, look, this 5-year plan of the communists worked really well. We should be doing the same thing. Whereas it's not really the same thing. They were behind it all, and they're not telling them. So what I think is quite important about the story is we see here the collusion behind the scenes to build the USSR up into a power and then kind of promote it to the rest of the world as being a benefit of communism. It's exactly what has been happening with China more recently. So China, are they doing all this by themselves, or is there a take two happening? So with American companies, it's kind of a tax dodge thing where they can, it's a legal tax dodge, where they send their equipment over, their technical products over to be made in China because they've got a lot of expertise over there and they don't pay any VAT on the added value. But what that means is effectively all your technology is then going over to be assembled in China where it can be copied. So it's almost like a transfer of technology, exactly the same way as back in the 30s they were transferring all this technology over to the Soviet Union to build it up, and they've been doing the same with China. So even Sky News was reporting last week that it's been found that China put a little chip smaller than a grain of rice in every single Apple product that was sold in the West. So that's great. So if you've got an Apple, you're working on an idea, you're an entrepreneur, you're a scientist, you're open to having all your information stolen and hacked. So when they talk about the intellectual property theft, well, I know Trump talks about that a lot, that by China, and he wants to clamp down on it. It's not a fluke. It's not just happening. It's being allowed to happen to build up China because they want to promote the Chinese model to us as the next big thing, the direction they want us all to go in. So they need to have it be seen as a marvelous success because otherwise, why would we go in that direction? You may have remembered, but back in the 90s, when Bill and Clinton were getting ready to fight for their second term, there was something called the Chinagate scandal. So they were desperate for money for their campaign. So what they did was the big tech companies went to Bill and Hillary and they said, well, if we sell some of our technology to China, we'll give you, if you're allowed to do that, we'll give you more donations for your campaign. And that is when it started, the transfer of this technology to China. In fact, in some cases, it was so serious that it enabled China to identify the cause of a rocket failure, and it helped advance their missile program, which actually threatens US national security. So you can see, this is not in the interests of ordinary people and in the security of America to be doing all this. So what do we have here? We have this promotion of the Soviet Union. And do you think for a moment that the people behind this, the key industrialists, were worried about the people in the gulag camps, in the slave labor camps, people being disappeared all over the Soviet Union, people living in terrible conditions and in slave labor conditions? No, they weren't cared about that. They also weren't cared about, the American youngsters being killed in the Vietnam War, in many cases by weapons that were developed according to Western technology. So all the car parts in the USSR had equipment from the West. The atomic reactors were copies of those from the West. The US, the Switzerland and the UK must have given them the nuclear technology. 60% of their marine diesel engines came from technical assistance agreements with the West. Dunlop gave them rubber tire technology. There was a deliberate policy to build up the USSR military so we could have this sort of arms race going on, which is also very manipulative, isn't it? This person I was talking to earlier, Arm & Hammer, he gave the Republicans $100,000 back in the 70s, and yet his father was the head of the Communist Party there. So you can see how they were wrangling behind the scenes, all of them working together. So we're asking ourselves, now that we've had a look at that, what is this big attraction about this whole communism lock? Why do they like it? Well, If you ever studied economics or did a few business studies in university, you would have heard of a SWOT analysis. So that is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So what's a big threat if you're in big business? It's a change of government. Change of government, change in industrial policy, maybe you'll lose your edge, maybe the new government coming in won't be as favorable to you. Isn't it great to have someone like Xi Jinping in China, who's a dictator for life? That's wonderful, because then you're in with the government, you know you're in, and you're in forever. You don't have to worry that, oh, well, down the road, there's going to be 5 years, there's going to be an election, and we'll have to assemble all our brow and envelopes and make sure we get in the pocket of all the right politicians again to ensure we maintain our advantage. No, you've bought your way into the government and you are there for good. And once you're there, there's endless opportunities because you're in charge of the industrial policy and you're getting all the contracts. What's more is you collude with the government to get regulation that suits you, taxation that suits you, and this regulation may not suit your smaller competitors, so you've created all these barriers for entry. So you're there, you've got the position, you don't have to worry if you've got any weaknesses because there's no one coming up, no competition coming up that's going to threaten you. So you can see how great communism is for big business, which is hence why they're so keen on it. Once they're in there, they're in there. They're in there for good. They get richer and richer and richer, and the other people get more and more powerful, and the government like it because they are permanently in control as well. How do we see this affecting our society in every day? Well, communism, it's about some kind of sanctimonious, anally retentive, control freak busybody wanting to control our lives. They don't like to let markets operate and have, supply and demand. They think they know better what's good for us and what we should be having. So they're always trying to control everything. And that's why everything's down to ideology rather than down to profit and loss. And so, of course, it becomes incredibly unproductive and inefficient. You can also see this, for example, in the UK with the police. What should their mission statement be? Fight crime, maintain law and order. And yet, there was a policeman on the news actually this morning saying that police shouldn't be worrying about investigating wolf whistles, they should be investigating burglaries. But no, that's not really happening because wolf whistles is on the agenda. It's more ideological, isn't it? Some guy phoned up once and he said he had a burglary and he rang the police and they said, well, don't worry, we'll send you a fingerprint testing kit. Wow, now that is a fun way to spend a Saturday night, isn't it? I remember this year when they were doing the Gay Pride March, there was a picture that appeared on the internet of two police officers, and they were both holding a lead, and at the end of the lead there was a human being sort of crouched in a, what would we say, like an at-heel position, and they had leather masks with little ears over their faces to make them look like Doberman pinchers with a studded collar, and then similar apparel on their body to make them look like I say, like dogs, but they were humans. And the police had the leads holding those. Now, I thought to myself, well, but that's not about gay pride. That's not about anything. It's about a fetish, actually, and why are the police involved in this? And again, it's this whole ideological thing that's taking over the actual functions. And you get similar things happening, whether it's be in the NHS, they're always going on all the problems in London, but Sadiq Khan is more worried about transgender toilets, which I think is a big red herring, because if you've been to any kind of bar, coffee shop, restaurant now, mostly there's one toilet for everybody to use anyway, so it's not a thing. So again, you can see here that our whole society is being moved away from what is value for money, or what mission statement of various organizations could be, and it's being run more on like kind of ideological agenda. And you get it a lot too with your, let's see, because of course, yeah, the other big thing that communism is on is creating oppressed classes. Everyone's part of a different group, and these groups are in potential conflict with each other. Everyone's got a grievance. Communism is all about telling people, well, if you're not doing very well, you must be being oppressed, and that's your problem. You need to have a grievance, and there seems to be a pecking order of agreements. If you kind of pick a Twitter argument with someone who's slightly higher than you, then you're probably slated to fail. The other big thing we always know, this blows me away, because whenever I watch the American elections, Donald Trump is always talking about creating jobs, 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 jobs. And yet here in Western Europe, they're always telling us, we've got tons of jobs. We're hemorrhaging jobs. The jobs coming out our ears. We need masses of millions of people coming in with immigration to fill all these jobs. If local people don't have a job, well, I don't know, maybe they're just lazy, maybe they're just stupid, I don't know what their problem is, but we've got tons of jobs. And then they'll tell us, but there's a skills shortage. Well, 15 years ago, only about 7% of people went to university. Now it's 50%, but we've got a skills shortage. Does any of this make sense? No, this is not meant to make sense. Then they're always telling us that diversity is our strength is diversity is a magic wand and makes everything great. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, if you went on one of those shows, you know, like Dragon's Den, and you wanted funding for your business or some venture capital, and the funder said to you, well, tell me all about your business. And you said, well, we've got diversity. And he'd say, yeah, okay, you've got diversity. What else have you got? Do you have good management? Are you very productive? Do you have some patents? Do you do research and development? Are you highly innovative? No, we've just got diversity. Okay, next. I mean, it wouldn't fly, would it? And yet it seems to be the only idea that our government has where it's more of kind of a social thing than a political thing. But again, it's feeding into this whole thing that we're totally moving away from what's important, from what really makes the economy tick, and we're being sidetracked with all these other social ideas and making us forget what's really going on. So the great thing, though, about communism for these big industrialists is it's an easy sell. The whole thing about cradle-to-grave care and no one left behind, no winners, no losers, all this kind of fairness, everyone being treated equally, which never is the way it works out. It sounds terrific. So they love to foist it on you. And because the income distribution graph is so skewed towards the bottom with so many more people below average because of, I mean, about 100 people contain half the world's wealth, it's very easy for people to feel aggrieved and to feel that they are not getting what they're due, and therefore the left is able to play on this on these grievances, which in many cases are real and legitimate, but they tell people this is the answer when it's not really the answer. It's only the answer that is going to further empower the political elite, further suit the key industrialists, the biggest businesses, and the big tech firms. And so what do we have here? Where are we back to it? The Vulcanus Agenda. It's not really about are the left aligned with the communists or the socialists or with the capitalists and the industrialists and big business and the bankers. It's not about that. It's not about left or right. It's all a massive power grab, and you are being manipulated on a lower level to think that it's about left and right when it's not. It's about them getting more and more power, getting more untouchable, getting more away from us, and with us stuck on this level where we are having all our power taken away from us. So that is communism, where I think we're at, where we've been with it, how the whole history of communism was a lie. It was a fabricated, almost like the Soviet Union was, a testing ground, and now they've moved on and it's China that's the testing ground for it. Hence everything that's happening. So a lot of the stories we see, they don't really make sense about the intellectual property theft of China and all that. It's because they're trying to build that country up and then sell it to us as the way forward, the alternative to capitalism. I've, just to say quickly at the end of that, I've also got a vlog coming up quite soon on Saudi Arabia and the murder of Khashoggi, or Khashoggi, as I think someone said it. Also the Germany. I know you've all been impatient and you've been nagging me a long time for Germany, but there's so much going on in the German chart. I just couldn't take it lightly, so I had to really ponder it. That's coming up, and also one on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, because you felt that I didn't really chat enough about that when I did my vlog before on worldwide predictions. Okay, thanks guys. It was a very long one. Thanks for sticking with it, and I hope it has given you some, a little bit of insight into this whole thing.